This is DevOps in Agile Way podcast.
Hello again. Today we will talk about the toughest topic so far in Calms, measurements, letter M. But this is the most tough topic as long as we will not go to the sharing, so the last letter of Calms. Let's focus on measurements. And the first question which we need to ask and then try to answer is how to measure measurements. And the second thing which we need to explain what these measurements are. So first of all, measurements doesn't mean monitoring, okay? So we do not monitor performance, response times, etc., etc., etc. Measurements here are about the process. There are, well, let's say a few approaches which we can use in order to work with it. First, what we need to start with is something what is called DORA metrics. Probably I will do the episode where I will focus on this a little bit more than just to go through this, go to the surface only. We need to at least explain this a little bit. So what is DORA metrics? Well, so DORA metrics are the 4 base metrics proposed some time ago by Google, and we have 4 of them. We have deployment frequency. It means how often we deploy. We have lead time for changes. So how long it takes from the beginning of work on the change to deploy this change to the production and have it useful. Mean time to recover. This is the time which we need, average time, which we need to recover from failure. And change failure rate. It means how often we have problems, how often our deployments failed, how often we deploy something what is wrong. So this is something what we can see in DORA metrics. We can split those 4 metrics into 2 categories, right? So deployment frequency and lead time for changes. We can say this measure team velocity, and change failure rate and time to restore will be part of the stability measurements. With different reports about DevOps states, etc., we can see some numbers, some data about how good our company is in relation to those metrics. And I don't want to go into, deep into this, but generally we have like 4 categories there: elite, high, medium, low, in terms of how good we are against these metrics. So for example, for deployment frequency, the elite companies will have these deployments on demand and multiple deployments per day. High, medium, and then low. And low means that, for example, fewer than once per 6 months, right? Or something like that. So we have this kind of buckets where we can put ourselves and the companies to understand better where we are. We can also say that those 4 metrics are the most popular here, but we can say that there is a 5th metric, reliability. And as far as I'm familiar with this, it came to the picture somewhere in 2021, and it was like a put into this. But honestly, I didn't saw many reports. Well, I didn't saw any report which has this reliability metric included. Here we have, as I said, 4 or 5, depends, metrics, main metrics, which we can use in order to measure our quality, our performance, our adoption of DevOps. And also if anything is going worse, better, why, when, etc., etc., etc. But those 4 metrics, I always say that they are like the beginning of the journey. Because we look through those metrics on very high level aspect. Let's take this deployment frequency. For example, depends on the industry, it may be different as well. I do not suppose that DevOps teams in, let's say, healthcare or financial sectors will deploy like 10 times per day. Of course they can, but I'm not sure if something like that is happening really. So here we also need to understand what this measurement, what this metric is really measuring, and how, for example, this deployment looks like and what this deployment really means. Because probably we can measure not the deployment frequency, but delivery frequency. And then the picture will change a lot. Why this aspect is very important? So first, to select and understand the metrics, and then use those metrics, measure the process, measure every aspect of our DevOps landscape. It's kind of simple, because if you don't measure things, if you don't understand things, you cannot improve them. Simple like that. So that's why we have measurements. And some will say that we should measure everything. I will say we should measure only those things which are important from the business perspective, of course. We should collect this data, store this data, and based on the historical data and current data, build the trends, build the understanding, and build the potential areas where we see risks, because this is also possible here. These measurements are also very important and very vital part of feedback loops, because first of all, we need to, let's say, send back information, what's going on, how it is going on. It will be not completed without information about some numbers. What these numbers can be, it depends. But generally, if you want to improve something, you need to have data, what is wrong, and some, target probably. As I said, we heard a couple of times already, measure everything. Even in one article, kind of old article from 2019, DevOps Colmes model in kanbanzone.com, we have the sentence, measure everything. Continuous improvement requires an empirical process. Expose your data and be transparent so that you can inspect and adapt. I agree with that. But measuring everything is like a waste of resources. And here we are touching lean again, right? And of course, these measurements should be done in the automatic way. So we are touching A right now. So we already touched A and L from Colmes. And surprise, surprise, of course, understanding, applying, and let's say living with these measurements is part of the culture. So we have already CALL, and we didn't talk about sharing to this point, but imagine this is also part of the sharing. How the situation looks like, how the situation can be improved, how it was improved, what we learned, etc., etc., etc. Again, you can see here that every single letter, in this case measurement, is very much connected with all others. So this is one living organism, really. Now, I know that we all love KPIs, etc., etc., etc. But these measurements, starting from this 4, which I mentioned on the beginning, can be part of the KPI for the team or organization to improve, to decrease the failure rate, to increase the deployment frequency, etc., etc., etc. Right? The proper KPI needs to be measurable. So again, we have the connection between measurements, measurable things like KPIs, and the process itself, right? What kind of metrics we can have, except of course the DORA metrics? For example, recurring issues. If we have the same issues, how many of them, how often we have them, etc., etc., right? And what we did in order to get rid of them. For example, something what can be very tightly connected with deployment frequency is pipeline execution time. Because if our deployment frequency will be higher than execution time of the pipeline, it's hard to me to imagine this kind of scenario, but well, let me say some anecdote. Many years ago, I used to work for bank, and we had the process called end of day. So this is the closing the day in the bank, doing some, mathematical stuff, etc., 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 and then opening the new day. It was obvious that the process needs to be done in the middle of the night. That was simple because, the bank is not operating in the night. We do the end of day in the night. But once we had the situation in one system that end of day operation took 25 hours. Let me repeat this again. End of day operation took 25 hours. So what it means? First of all, It means that this specific system, it was like a testing system, so it doesn't matter really, is not ready to be used in any way. Second, what is very important, if the process took 25 hours and one day has 24 hours, as we very well know, what it means really? I think you have answer for yourself here. So now coming back to the deployment frequency and pipeline execution time. If the situation is like that we have, for example, very extensive tests, and those tests took like 5 hours, and our pipeline is running for 5 hours, and we want to run this pipeline 10 times per day, we need to answer to ourselves if this is, worth to do or maybe not. We can count, for example, failed pipelines ratio. We can count monitoring complexity, for example. I would like to invite you to read something more about this, especially on the Samologic webpage. They have a very nice article in their blog, Objectives-Driven Observability, where they talk about this, about the monitoring complexity. Because this is also very important. And as I said, we shouldn't measure everything in the same way we shouldn't monitor everything, because we have, in this case, we have much more noise than we should, and we probably can just lose the awareness what's going on. If we have too many communicates, if we have too many messages, if we have too many alerts, we can very easily lost ourselves in this. That will be enough for today about the measurements. Next time we will talk, and this will be the last episode about columns, at least for now. We will talk about sharing, and I will mention my idea for the sharing, what can be different here. So stay tuned and see you next week.
Thank you for listening to this episode of DevOps in Agile Way podcast with your host, Pavel Pivosh. Subscribe, comment, and do not forget to check our next episodes. Stay tuned. Stay safe. Stay curious.